Are you an autistic adult and you find yourself wanting to convey to other people that you communicate differently in specific ways, or that you think differently in specific ways, but don't necessarily want to bring the word autism into the context of a particular relationship, conversation, project, etc.? If you are, you're going to want to watch the rest of this video because today's topic is about ways to convey some of these things to other people, but in an attempt to have them focus on what your needs are and how you think and how you communicate are, rather than putting implicit bias into the conversation. Um, because a lot of people have preconceived notions of what autism is like in people, even though we in the autistic community know that every person with autism has different ways in which autism affects them. And just because you know one person with autism, that means you know one person with autism. If you're new to the channel, just a touch about me. My name's Jen. I'm the kind of old autistic lady, and I'm a late diagnosed autistic woman, middle aged, as you can tell by looking at me. Um, and I've known that I'm autistic since November. So 2, 3 months, 3, 4 months. I can't count anymore. It's February. Okay, so I want to first come out and say that I'm not in any way trying to say that anybody, myself included, necessarily needs to keep autism as a hidden thing. Okay, every person needs to do for themselves what they feel is right for themselves. And I myself personally am not quite ready in my own relationships with people, particularly people that I'm not super close to, but that I do need to have relationships with, whether we're talking about social or professional relationships, to where I've noticed at times that telling people that I'm autistic doesn't necessarily garner the reaction out of the other person that I'm hoping for. And my attempts to explain my needs and ways that I've reflected upon ways I do things, people just tend to um, react differently. And I'm assuming they're not autistic. They could be, but I'm assuming we're talking about people that are otherwise neurodivergent or neurotypical. And I can get a totally different reaction out of people without using the word autism. And my experience so far has been that those times are when I'm having more success in getting my needs met. So I want to bring up a couple of examples in my own personal life, some of which are professional, some of which are personal. But what I find is that when I'm talking about these things in my own life, I'm trying to either help the other person understand that I understand how I am, and that if the context is right, they have permission to help guide me to not be that way. An example of that is I know that I'm long winded. I know that my train of thought doesn't necessarily go in a straight line from point A to point B for how other people tend to put ideas together. And so I've been telling people that, I realize that this is how I am. And if we're short on time, or if they're starting to wonder where I'm going with something, especially if I have a relationship with this person to begin with, it's not somebody brand new, that I can say, you have permission to ask me to get to the point. Okay. That doesn't necessarily mean that I want you saying it to me all the time. But if we're short on time, or you're not following my train of thought, or I touched on a topic and you were with me, and then I went to this other topic and you don't see how it fits with the first topic, let me say it, but then ask me to guide you back to how the two ideas relate to each other, because it's not always clear to other people the way it is that I see it in my head. Another example is when I am talking to people and what I'm trying to get out of them is to understand my intentions behind saying things or behind asking things. I find the direct approach of just saying what it is up front to be a lot more effective. So, probably the most germane example of this in my own life is I ask a lot of questions. I have always asked a lot of questions. I will always ask a lot of questions. And I tell people up front, I do this for one of three reasons. Either number one, I need clarity, and it's a genuine sense of I need to understand why the other person has said what they've said or explained that I need to do something a certain way. Number two, I get excited about the topic and I want to understand everything there is to know about that topic, and either in rapid bursts in that conversation or over time, I may ask a lot of questions because I like understanding how the various pieces fit together. And that other person might only be concerned with one part of the puzzle. And I'm concerned with understanding each individual piece of the puzzle. And so if they know in advance that that's what I'm doing, and they know, especially if there's a limited amount of time or they themselves are, um, I'm just going to come out and say it, they know that they're distracted by something else going on in their lives or whatever, that they know, okay, this is why I'm doing it. It's not to annoy them. It's not to give the impression that I don't know what I'm doing. Because I definitely have encountered people that think that that's the reason, that they're telling me about part A of a particular topic and I'm asking about part B and C, and they're like, well, that means you don't understand part A. And that's not the thing at all. It's that I want to understand part A, B, and C and their individual components so that I can understand how they work together as a larger whole. Or I tell them the other reason I ask questions is because I am just plain a curious person. I'm just plain curious. I like to know a lot of things about a lot of different things. Learning things makes me happy, and it can be over the most mundane thing in the world, but if I'm learning about it, I'm generally happy, unless it has to do with like math or something, because I'm not a math person. Um, and I will tell people, I'm not asking questions because I necessarily don't understand or that I'm questioning a process that exists already, or that I'm questioning that the person has the right authority to tell me to do something or the right experience to tell me how to do something. It's very, very rarely ever one of those things. So I like to explain that up front if I know that I'm going to have a relationship with this person over time in either a personal or professional capacity, to where it's going to be helpful for them to know how to communicate with me. And it's going to be helpful for me to know, okay, I've given you permission to interrupt me if you don't understand how parts A and B, ideas A and B that I'm talking about relate to each other. And I'm just going on, or I'm to that other person seemingly jumping from one topic to the next and getting tangential. Okay, I've given them permission. If they don't jump in and correct me, then I don't have to constantly be wondering, does this other person understand where I'm coming from or understand why I'm asking what I'm asking? So that's one set of things. Another set of things that I have found are useful for me is to explain how I think in words that other autistic people and at times other neurodivergent people who may not be autistic but have an overlap, like a lot of people that have both ADHD and autism would understand. And that is to, I'm going to take my glasses off because I just am. Um, so, in other words, um, I'm kind of speaking in code so that if the other person does have other autistic people in their lives, that we autistic people at times talk about things using certain terminology. For example, in a recent interview I had for a job, I explained to every interviewer in the process that I'm a bottom up thinker, that I see the details before I see the larger picture, and that I get in the weeds of things because that's how I think. Explaining that and talking about bottom up thinking gives the other person not only an understanding of how I think if they're never, been exposed to somebody who has used that terminology before, but also if they themselves are autistic or they themselves have autistic friends or family that in particular are able to communicate how they think, that are able to either verbalize that or explain that through nonverbal means, that they're like, oh, this person might be autistic. They're not telling me they're autistic, but I need to kind of like, okay, try to take what people are saying myself, and look at that in a different way. Um, and I also really appreciate it when people ask questions of me that make me think that they know that I might be autistic. And whether or not this is true, I'm going to tell you in one of the interviews I had just recently for a job, one of the interviewers said to me right at the beginning of the interview, I do not like the question, tell me about yourself. I want to know, what are your hobbies? And that was so refreshing for me to hear the question asked in that way, because it gave me permission to talk about things that genuinely make me excited and happy without putting the pressure on of no, of wondering, well, when you say tell me about yourself, what are you really getting at? Because different people in different contexts for different levels of interviews mean different things when they ask that question. um Not gonna lie though, I had like an internal dialogue going on in my brain going, don't info dump, don't info dump, don't info dump, because I was there to talk about my qualifications for the job and not to sit there and talk about sheep stamps and goat stamps for, a half hour. So I was brief because I was self-aware of what was going on. But that type of a question is something that I think if I'm ever part of a panel interview, interviewing somebody that maybe would be on the same team as I am, I think is a great question, because people who are both autistic and not autistic can appreciate that question, that the person's trying to get to know who you are, is trying to make sure that you can communicate the things you enjoy, the things you have a passion about, and can also understand and be self-aware enough of, okay, I've talked about this for a couple of minutes. I'm going to self-direct into other things in the interview. Um, and the last point I want to make about a set of skills that I find myself doing, or a way of expressing how I communicate differently, is to explain to people that I tend to front load a conversation or a topic by telling somebody why I want to tell them about the following topic before I ever tell them about the topic. This in particular is a method of communication that I have that can be really difficult for me to have with other people if they don't understand that, number one, I know what I'm doing, I have a reason for doing it, and that they have permission that if they need me to just get to the point, that I'm capable of stopping that front loading process. So an example of this is in one of the interviews I had. I wanted to know what the stability of that role is projected to be. And so I was very direct in asking the question, but I front loaded it by saying something to the effect of, in the last couple of years, I was let go from a job due to mass layoffs. And there is a lot of uncertainty economically in the country right now. And, I've read things about different departments at this particular organization having mass layoffs. Can you tell me a little bit about what you envision? Obviously, you don't have a crystal ball, but what you think the stability pattern of this position is. And when I ask the question in that way, the person knows, okay, I'm concerned about this because I've experienced it in the recent past. And if I'm going to make this career jump or this position jump, that I really am only interested in doing it if they can communicate that they think it's going to be a stable role for a while. The person then answered my question and talked about different things that aren't germane to this video. But I front load it. And so if I have a relationship with somebody who doesn't know that I front load, what typically happens is I start to front load, and then that other person in the conversation thinks they know where I'm going, but they don't even know what question I'm going to ask or what topic I'm really going to discuss. And then they start interjecting, and I get very frustrated. Or they start assuming that they know what I'm going to say or ask, and they take the conversation over because they're tired of me going on when I haven't even talked about the topic at hand yet. And it causes a lot of friction because I get frustrated, they get frustrated back, and then I have to say, okay, no, stop the train. This is the main idea of the thing we need to talk about, but I'm asking you because of X, Y, and Z. As opposed to my normal thinking pattern is, because of X, Y, and Z, I need to know A. And if people know that I am aware that I do this and that I want them to, number one, stick with me if they're capable of it until I get to the point that I want to bring up or the question I want to ask. But number two, that if they're tempted to jump in and assume and just answer or say what they're going to say, they need to know that I am irritated by people doing that. Just outright, I'm irritated by people doing that. And so this one I approach a little bit differently when I explain it to people. I'm not quite as direct and say I'm irritated when people do this to me. But instead, if I know that I'm going to have a new relationship with somebody that we be dealing with on a pretty frequent basis, what I will tell them is, I have a tendency to explain the why of something before I explain the something. Or if I'm asking a question, I have a tendency to explain to you why I'm about to ask you a question before I get to the question. And if you don't have time for that approach at any particular time, let me know. It is so much better. It is so much better. And that's not to say it's a perfect way to head things off, but I suspect, because I've been, ever since I got my diagnosis a few months ago, I've really been thinking about how other people communicate. I mean, I mask, and I'm not saying that I do a good job of masking, but I am a high masking person. And I've been observing how people interact in a different way than I was before. I was always like observing it so that I could figure out what to do. And now I find myself observing it so that I can understand the ways in which I communicate differently, so that I can help mitigate the fact that I do communicate differently to work with the other person's style of communication, because I don't think it's my job to mask and necessarily communicate like the other person all the time or anything like that, because that is how burnout happens and whatnot. But I also don't think it's fair for me to just communicate how I want to communicate all the time and not expect that other person to adjust to me. So I'm trying to get it in a happy medium, but without introducing that internal bias about autism. And to be fair, I have definitely told people that I'm autistic and had good responses, but more often than not, people need to know me before I feel safe enough to do that, and to know if the way they were treating me before is different than the way they treat me after I tell them I'm autistic. So um, if you found any of this helpful, I'm happy that you watched the video. Like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. I appreciate all the time you've spent watching, and leave a comment, either if you agree or disagree with anything I've talked about, if you yourself have other strategies for communicating to other people how you communicate and how it's best for other people to communicate with you, particularly if you're a late diagnosed autistic adult who is recently diagnosed, who's going about this from the opposite way that it ideally would happen. Because if a person knows from the time they're very young that they're autistic, then your whole life is informed by the fact that you know you're autistic. In my case, because I just thought I was really bad at being a neurotypical person my entire life, um, I feel like the horse was in front of the cart for so long that I now need to experiment with different ways that the horse can pull the cart. Um, and so I get lots of meaning and encouragement by understanding what other people do as well. And of course, we can help each other. So thanks for watching. Take care.